The royal selection chamber hummed with the whispered ambitions of a dozen civilizations as Prince Adrian Thorne surveyed the assembled candidates. Tomorrow would mark his 25th birthday, and ancient law demanded he choose a companion from among the galaxy's most eligible representatives. The stakes couldn't be higher. His choice would determine military alliances, trade agreements, and the political landscape for the next generation. The Valerian princess brings 3 star systems and a fleet that could double our naval capacity, whispered Chancellor Hayes at his elbow. Princess Zethra of the Tech Consortium offers manufacturing capabilities that would advance our industry by decades. Adrian nodded absently, his attention caught by movement in the far corner of the chamber. While the other candidates held court with elaborate displays of their wealth and power. Holographic projections of conquered worlds, demonstrations of advanced technology, even a small gravitational field manipulation by the Centauri delegate, one figure sat alone. She was pale in a way that seemed almost translucent, with silver hair that caught the chamber's artificial light like spun starlight. Her clothing was simple compared to the elaborate ceremonial garments worn by the others, and she seemed to occupy her chair as if she might disappear at any moment. "Who is that?" Adrian asked, gesturing toward the isolated figure. Chancellor Hayes followed his gaze and frowned. "Lady Kira of, let me check the records, apparently some Outer Rim territory called Shadowhaven. I'm not sure why she was included in the selection, honestly. Her world has no strategic value, no significant resources, no military to speak of. Then why is she here? Political correctness, I assume. The Galactic Council requires representation from all member worlds, no matter how insignificant." Hayes turned his attention back to the major players. Now, about the Valerian alliance. But Adrian's eyes remained fixed on the woman in the corner. She sat with perfect posture despite her apparent frailness, her hands folded in her lap, watching the proceedings with an expression that seemed more sad than hopeful. When their eyes met across the chamber, she didn't look away with the coy calculation he'd seen from the other candidates. Instead, she held his gaze with something that looked like quiet acceptance of disappointment. "Prince Adrian," came a melodious voice behind him. He turned to find Princess Zethra approaching, her bioluminescent skin patterns shifting in colors that indicated diplomatic interest. "I was hoping we might have a moment to discuss the benefits of our potential union." "Of course, Your Highness." Adrian allowed himself to be drawn into conversation, though part of his attention remained on the pale woman who had somehow captured his curiosity. The evening progressed with the expected political maneuvering. Each candidate presented their case with varying degrees of subtlety, the promise of military protection, technological advancement, economic prosperity. Adrian played his part, asking appropriate questions and making diplomatic responses while his advisors took detailed notes on potential alliance structures. "The selection ceremony begins at dawn," announced the court herald as the evening drew to a close. "His Royal Highness will make his choice according to the ancient traditions." As the candidates began filing out of the chamber, Adrian noticed that Lady Kira was among the first to leave, moving with careful steps that suggested either physical frailty or extreme caution. She paused at the doorway and glanced back once, meeting his eyes again with that same resigned acceptance before disappearing into the corridor. "An interesting evening," Chancellor Hayes commented as they walked back to Adrian's quarters. "I trust you've had time to consider your options carefully." "I have." Adrian kept his expression neutral as his advisors launched into detailed analyses of each candidate's strategic value. "The Valerian military alliance alone would secure our borders for the next century," General Morrison pointed out. "And the economic advantages of the Tech Consortium partnership could revolutionize our infrastructure." "What about Lady Kira?" Adrian asked casually. The conversation stopped. His advisors exchanged glances that ranged from confused to concerned. "Your Highness," Hayes said carefully, "surely you're not seriously considering the Outer Rim candidate. She brings nothing to the table, no military strength, no economic advantage, no political connections worth mentioning. Sometimes the most interesting choices are the ones that don't make obvious sense." "This isn't about interesting, Adrian," General Morrison said, dropping formality in his concern. This is about the security and prosperity of our kingdom. We need allies who can contribute to our strength, not charity cases. Adrian said nothing, but privately he wondered what kind of strength required hiding in corners and accepting dismissal with such quiet grace. Dawn came with the traditional fanfare. The selection chamber had been reconfigured for the ceremony, with the candidates arranged in a semicircle before the prince's throne. Adrian took his place in full ceremonial regalia, aware that his choice would be broadcast across the galaxy and analyzed by political strategists for years to come. Let the ancient words be spoken, intoned the court herald. By blood right and sacred law, Prince Adrian Thorn of the Terran Kingdom shall choose his companion from among those assembled, binding our realm to the destiny he selects. Adrian rose, his gaze sweeping across the candidates. Princess Zethara stood confident and radiant. The Valerian representative held herself with military bearing that promised strength in alliance. Other candidates displayed their various assets through posture and expression. Lady Kira stood at the far end of the line, her pale hands clasped before her, looking as if she might faint from the attention. When his eyes reached her, she offered the smallest of nods, not hopeful, just acknowledging his notice before what she clearly expected to be his dismissal. I choose, Adrian announced, his voice carrying clearly through the chamber's perfect acoustics, Lady Kira of Shadowhaven. The silence that followed was so complete that Adrian could hear the hum of the life support systems. Then the chamber erupted. Laughter came first, sharp, disbelieving sounds from the other candidates and their entourages. Whispered exclamations of, "Impossible," and, "What is he thinking?" rippled through the assembled nobility. Even some of his own advisors made sounds of distress. Lady Kira herself appeared stunned, her already pale complexion turning nearly white as she stared at him with wide eyes. "Are you certain, Your Highness?" the herald asked, his voice carrying the faintest suggestion that perhaps the prince had misspoken. "I am certain." The laughter grew louder, less restrained. Adrian heard fragments of commentary from the crowd, charity case. Political suicide. What alliance could she possibly offer? Through it all, Lady Kira remained frozen in place, looking as shocked as everyone else by his choice. When the herald gestured for her to step forward, she moved as if in a dream, her steps uncertain and her breathing shallow. "The selection is made," Adrian announced over the continuing murmur of disbelief. Lady Kira of Shadowhaven. As she reached his side, she looked up at him with an expression he couldn't quite read, gratitude mixed with something that might have been fear. "Your Highness," she whispered, her voice barely audible even in the slowly quieting chamber, "are you certain this is what you want?" Adrian looked down at her pale, upturned face and felt something shift in his chest, not romantic attraction, exactly, but a sense of rightness that had nothing to do with political advantage. "I am," he said quietly. "The question is whether it's what you want." Her smile was tremulous but genuine. "I suppose we'll find out together." Behind them, the court continued to buzz with shocked speculation, but Adrian found he didn't care. He had made his choice, and something told him it was going to be far more interesting than anyone, including himself, could possibly imagine. 3 days after the selection ceremony, Adrian found himself defending his choice for what felt like the 100th time. This morning's interrogation came courtesy of his sister, Princess Elena, who had cornered him in the palace gardens during his attempt at a peaceful breakfast. "Adrian, everyone's talking," she said, settling beside him on the stone bench with the determination of someone prepared for a long conversation. "The Valerian ambassador actually asked me if you were feeling well. Apparently, choosing the weakest candidate in galactic history has some people questioning your mental state." "My mental state is fine, thank you." Adrian took another bite of his pastry, watching Kira across the garden where she sat reading beneath an ancient oak tree. Even at this distance, she looked fragile, a slight figure that seemed to barely cast a shadow. "Then explain it to me. What possible advantage does she bring to our kingdom?" Adrian had been asking himself the same question. The official reports on Lady Kira made for depressing reading. Orphaned at a young age, raised in state care on a minor colony world, no family connections, no significant education, no resources beyond a small stipend from her planetary government. By every measure that mattered to galactic politics, she was exactly what his advisors claimed, a charity case. Maybe advantage isn't everything, he said finally. Elena laughed. Since when? You're the one who spent 3 years negotiating the Centauri Trade Compact. You understand political maneuvering better than anyone. That was exactly what bothered him. The more time he spent with Kira, the more inconsistencies he noticed. Yesterday, she had corrected a protocol officer about the proper ceremonial greeting for Alterian dignitaries, a ritual that hadn't been used in over 2 centuries. When questioned, she blushed and claimed she read about it somewhere. Has she said anything about her background? Elena continued. Her family, her education, her world. Not much. She's quiet. Adrian watched as Kira turned a page in her book, her movements precise and careful. She speaks 7 languages fluently, though. 7 languages. I heard her conversing with the Draconian cultural attaché in perfect classical Draconic. When I asked her about it, she said she'd always been good with languages. Elena frowned. Classical Draconic has been dead for 400 years. They don't even teach it in universities anymore. I know. Their conversation was interrupted by a commotion near the palace's main entrance. A group of the other selected candidates, those who had been rejected in favor of Kira, were departing with their entourages. Princess Zethra caught sight of Adrian and approached with her characteristic bioluminescent skin patterns shifting to diplomatic neutrality. Prince Adrian, she said with perfect courtesy. I wanted to offer my congratulations on your selection before we depart. Thank you, Your Highness. I hope your journey home is pleasant. I'm sure it will be. Her patterns shifted subtly toward what Adrian recognized as polite condescension. I do hope your unconventional choice works out well for your kingdom. Princess Elena bristled at the implied insult, but Adrian kept his expression neutral. I'm confident it will. Zethra's gaze drifted toward Kira, still reading beneath her tree. She seems very delicate. I hope the responsibilities of a royal companion won't prove too overwhelming for someone of her background. I think you might be surprised by what she's capable of. Perhaps. Zethra's smile was perfectly diplomatic and completely unconvincing. Though I must admit, I'm curious about exactly what capabilities a minor colony world could have provided her. What was her education like? Her family's influence? Her world's resources? Why don't you ask her yourself? Adrian suggested. The color patterns on Zethra's skin flickered with what might have been amusement. Oh, I tried. Yesterday, actually. She seemed reluctant to discuss her background in any detail. Quite mysterious for someone from such a simple upbringing. After the rejected candidates departed, Adrian decided to satisfy his own curiosity. He found Kira exactly where she'd been all morning, absorbed in what appeared to be a leather-bound volume written in a script he didn't recognize. Interesting reading, he asked, settling onto the grass beside her bench. She startled slightly, closing the book quickly. Oh. Your Highness, I didn't hear you approach. Just Adrian, please. We're going to be spending considerable time together, formal titles will get exhausting. He gestured toward the book. What language is that? Language? Kira followed his gaze to the closed volume in her lap. Oh, it's just an old book I found in the palace library. Historical texts, nothing important. May I see? For a moment, she looked genuinely panicked. Then she forced a smile and handed over the book with obvious reluctance. Adrian opened it carefully, examining pages covered in symbols that seemed to shift and change when he wasn't looking directly at them. The text was definitely alien, but not from any writing system he recognized, and he'd studied most of the major galactic languages during his diplomatic training. This is fascinating. I've never seen script like this before. He looked up to find Kira watching him with an expression that seemed far too worried for someone discussing library books. Where did you say you found it? The restricted archives. I have research permissions. She reached for the book with hands that trembled slightly. It's probably very boring for anyone not interested in historical linguistics. Adrian handed the book back, noting how her grip tightened around it as if it were precious. Historical linguistics. Is that a particular interest of yours? I suppose you could say that. Her voice was barely above a whisper. I've always been drawn to old things. Old things like classical Draconic. Her pale skin managed to become even paler. I told you, I'm good with languages. Kira. Adrian kept his voice gentle but persistent. Classical Draconic isn't taught anywhere in the galaxy. The last native speakers died 3 centuries ago. How exactly did you learn it? She was quiet for so long that Adrian began to think she wouldn't answer. When she finally spoke, her voice carried a quality he'd noticed before, something that seemed older than her apparent age. Sometimes knowledge finds you rather than the other way around, she said cryptically. Your Highness, Adrian, why did you choose me? The sudden change of subject didn't escape his notice, but something in her tone made him consider the question seriously. Honestly? I'm not entirely sure. Everyone else seemed so focused on what they could take from this alliance. You seemed like someone who might give something instead. Give what? I have nothing to offer. Maybe that's exactly why I chose you. Adrian studied her face, noting details he'd missed before, the way her eyes seemed to hold depths that didn't match her apparent youth, the careful precision of her movements, the sense that she was always listening for something others couldn't hear. Kira, who are you really? For just a moment, her careful composure cracked. He saw something flicker across her expression, not fear, exactly, but something close to it. Then the moment passed, and she was smiling that gentle, self-deprecating smile again. I'm exactly what the reports say I am, Your Highness. A minor colonial orphan who somehow ended up in circumstances far above her station. She clutched the mysterious book tighter. I should probably return this to the library before someone notices it's missing. As she rose to leave, Adrian caught her hand gently. Her skin was cold, far colder than human normal, and for just an instant he could have sworn he felt something like electricity pass between them. Kira, he said quietly. Whatever you're hiding, you don't have to hide it from me. She looked down at their joined hands, then back up at his face with an expression of such profound sadness that it took his breath away. Some secrets are kept for good reasons, Adrian, she whispered. Some truths are more dangerous than lies. Then she was gone, leaving him sitting in the garden with more questions than answers and the lingering impression that he had chosen far more, and far less, than anyone realized. The attack came without warning during the pre-dawn hours when most of the palace slept. Adrian was jolted awake by alarms he'd never heard before, deep, resonant tones that seemed to vibrate through the stone itself. Emergency lighting bathed his chambers in red as he threw on clothes and rushed toward the command center. Report, he called as he burst into the Situation Room where General Morrison and Chancellor Hayes were already coordinating with Fleet Command. Multiple contacts emerging from hyperspace, Morrison announced grimly. Ships using technology we don't recognize. They appeared simultaneously in formation around the planet, no approach vector, no warning, no attempt at communication. Adrian studied the tactical display showing dozens of vessels arranged in perfect geometric patterns around their world. The ship designs were unlike anything in the galactic databases, sleek, dark, and somehow organic-looking despite their obvious technological sophistication. Have they made any demands? Just one. Hayes's face was pale. Total surrender within 6 hours, or they begin orbital bombardment. Who are they? What faction? That's the problem, Morrison said. We can't identify them. Their ships aren't broadcasting any identification signals, and their technology doesn't match anything in our records. It's as if they appeared out of nowhere. The command center doors slid open, and Adrian was surprised to see Kira enter quietly. She moved to an empty corner of the room, clearly trying not to interfere but apparently drawn by the crisis. Her pale face was even more colorless than usual, and her hands shook as she hugged herself for warmth. "Sir, called a communications officer, we're receiving a transmission. Audio only, but they're using, well, they're speaking in the old tongue." "The old tongue?" Adrian frowned. "You mean classical Terran?" "No, sir. Older than that. Pre-contact languages that haven't been spoken in over a millennium. Our translation systems can't parse it." Adrian was about to suggest consulting with the Xenolinguistics department when he heard a soft gasp from the corner. Kira had gone completely rigid, her eyes wide with what looked like terror. "Kira." He moved toward her. "Are you all right?" "Play the message," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "Play it again." The communications officer looked to General Morrison, who nodded. The speakers filled with sounds that seemed to carry an otherworldly quality, syllables that resonated with harmonics that made the air itself vibrate. Kira's reaction was immediate and dramatic. She swayed on her feet, gripping the wall for support as tears began streaming down her face. "They're speaking Shadow Tongue," she said in a voice that carried suddenly across the entire room. "They call themselves the Void Dominion. They say they've come home." The room fell silent except for the hum of electronic equipment. All eyes turned to Kira, who seemed to realize she'd revealed far more than she intended. "How do you know that language?" Morrison demanded. Kira looked trapped, her gaze darting between the faces staring at her. "I studied ancient languages. It's just academic knowledge." "Academic knowledge?" Hayes stepped forward. "Lady Kira, that language has been dead for longer than recorded history. There are no academic sources for learning it." "Play more of the message," Admiral Reeves interjected over the communication system. "If she can translate, we need to know what they're saying." The next segment of alien speech filled the room, and this time Adrian watched Kira's face carefully as she listened. Her expression shifted from fear to something approaching despair. "They're looking for someone," she translated, her voice growing smaller with each word. "The last daughter of the old bloodlines. They say they've waited long enough for her to reveal herself, and if she doesn't come forward willingly, they'll take this world apart to find her." "The last daughter of what bloodlines?" Morrison pressed. Kira was quiet for so long that Adrian thought she might not answer. When she finally spoke, her words were barely a whisper. "The Shadowborn dynasty. The rulers who held this sector of space before humanity rose to power." The room erupted in confused voices as historians and military strategists tried to make sense of her statement. Adrian knew his galactic history. The Shadowborn were legend, myth, stories told to explain certain archaeological finds and unexplained ruins scattered throughout human space. "That's impossible," Hayes said flatly. "The Shadowborn are extinct. Have been for centuries." "Apparently not," Kira replied with a bitter smile that looked wrong on her gentle features. "At least, not entirely." Before anyone could respond, the communication system crackled to life again. This time, the voice speaking in Shadow Tongue was different, deeper, more commanding, with an authority that seemed to resonate through dimensions. Kira listened with growing horror, then turned to face the assembled command staff. "He calls himself the Void Marshal. He says he knows she's here, the last heir to the Shadow Throne. He can sense her presence." Her voice cracked. "He gives her until sunset to present herself, or he begins systematic destruction of every population center until she emerges." "This is insane," Morrison said. "We're talking about mythological beings that supposedly died out before humans achieved spaceflight. The ships surrounding our planet would suggest otherwise," Admiral Reeves pointed out over the comm. Adrian found himself studying Kira with new eyes. Her knowledge of the language, her reaction to the transmission, her obvious terror. Pieces were falling into place in ways that both explained everything and nothing. "Kira," he said quietly, "is there something you need to tell us?" She met his gaze across the room, and for a moment he saw ancient pain in her eyes, not the sadness of a young woman, but the accumulated grief of someone who had lost everything and everyone she'd ever known. "The Void Dominion were our ancient enemies," she said finally. "They drove the Shadowborn from power, scattered our people across the galaxy, hunted us to near extinction. We thought they were gone forever." "Our people," Hayes repeated carefully. Kira's smile was heartbreaking in its sadness. "You chose well, Your Highness. You selected the one candidate who brings no political alliance, no military strength, no economic advantage." She paused, straightening slightly despite her obvious fear. "You chose the last surviving heir to a throne that ruled the stars when your ancestors were still discovering fire." The command center fell silent as the implications sank in. Adrian felt the world shift beneath his feet as he realized that his impulsive choice, the decision everyone had mocked, had just become either the salvation or the doom of his entire world. "The question now," Kira continued, her voice growing stronger, "is whether you still want me as your companion, now that you know exactly what kind of trouble I bring with me." Outside the command center windows, the alien ships continued their ominous patrol, waiting for an answer that would determine the fate of billions. The ancient crypts beneath the palace had been sealed for over 300 years, but somehow Kira had found her way inside. Adrian discovered her there 2 hours after the command center meeting had devolved into chaos, sitting among stone sarcophagi that predated human settlement of this world by millennia. "The security systems didn't even register your passage," he said, settling beside her on the cold stone floor. "How did you get past locks that require genetic authorization from the royal bloodline?" "Because these aren't your ancestors buried here," Kira replied softly, her voice echoing in the vaulted chamber. "They're mine." Adrian looked around the crypt with new eyes, noting details he'd missed in his previous visits. The architectural style was indeed different from human construction, more organic, as if the stone had been grown rather than carved. Symbols etched into the walls resembled the script he'd seen in Kira's mysterious book. "You've been here before." "Every night since I arrived at the palace. It's the only place I feel." She struggled for the right word. "Safe isn't right. Nothing about this situation is safe. But here, I remember who I used to be before I learned to hide." "Who were you?" Kira was quiet for a long moment, her pale fingers tracing symbols carved into the nearest tomb. "Princess Kirathene Shadowborn, last daughter of the Obsidian Throne, heir to a civilization that spanned half the galaxy when humanity was still bound to a single world." The formal titles sounded strange coming from someone who usually spoke in whispers and apologized for taking up space. Adrian tried to reconcile this revelation with the fragile woman he'd come to know. "How old are you, Kira?" "By human reckoning, nearly 800 years. By Shadowborn standards, barely an adolescent when my world fell." She looked up at him with eyes that suddenly seemed to carry the weight of centuries. "My people age differently. We're meant to live for thousands of years, but the technology that sustains us was lost when the Void Dominion destroyed our homeworld." "The technology that sustains you?" "Life resonance chambers. They distribute our life force across extended periods, allowing us to survive far longer than biological processes would normally permit." She gestured to her pale, fragile appearance. "But without proper maintenance, the technology slowly fails. Each year, I become a little weaker, a little more translucent, a little closer to simply fading away." Adrian felt pieces clicking into place. "That's why you seem so frail." "I'm dying, Adrian. Have been for centuries. The last of my people died nearly 300 years ago, and their life resonance chambers failed with them. I've been living on borrowed time ever since, sustained by failing technology and sheer stubbornness." "Is that why you came to the selection ceremony? Looking for help?" Kira's laugh was bitter. "I came looking for obscurity. I thought if I could blend in among the candidates, be rejected quickly and quietly, I could spend my remaining years in peaceful anonymity. She met his eyes. You disrupted that plan rather thoroughly. I'm not apologizing for choosing you. Even knowing what you know now. That I'm not human, that I bring no advantages to your kingdom, that my very presence has drawn ancient enemies to your world. Adrian considered the question seriously. Around them, the stone faces of long-dead Shadowborn rulers seemed to watch with carved eyes that might once have held the same otherworldly quality as Kira's. The court mocked me for choosing weakness, he said finally. They never considered that what looks like weakness might be something else entirely. What else could it be? Strength under impossible pressure. You've survived the destruction of your entire civilization, carried the weight of being the last of your kind for centuries, and instead of becoming bitter or seeking revenge, you learned to hide your pain so well that everyone saw only fragility. Adrian reached for her hand, noting again how cold her skin felt. That's not weakness, Kira. That's the kind of strength most people can't even imagine. Tears began flowing down her cheeks, not the careful, composed weeping he'd witnessed before, but raw, overwhelming emotion that seemed to come from centuries of suppressed grief. I watched my world burn from space, she whispered. The Void Dominion doesn't just conquer, they consume. They drain the life force from entire planets, leaving nothing but empty husks drifting in space. My parents, my siblings, everyone I ever knew, they didn't just die, Adrian. They were unmade. Why did you survive? Because I was here, on this world, studying in these very crypts when the attack came. My parents had sent me to research our oldest archives, looking for something. She stopped abruptly, her expression shifting to one of sudden realization. Oh. Oh, they knew. Knew what? Kira stood and moved to a particular tomb near the center of the chamber, her hands running over symbols that seemed to glow faintly at her touch. My parents sent me here just weeks before the attack. They said it was for historical research, but they must have sensed something. This tomb belongs to Empress Valethera, the last ruler to successfully fight off a Void Dominion invasion. Your parents knew the attack was coming? Not specifically, but Shadowborn royalty develops certain sensitivities over time. We can feel disturbances in what you might call the cosmic order. Her fingers found a hidden mechanism in the carved stone, and the tomb's lid began to shift with the sound of ancient machinery awakening. They sent me to find this. Inside the sarcophagus, instead of remains, lay an object that made Adrian's breath catch. It looked like a crown, but one made of crystallized shadow, material that seemed to absorb light while somehow remaining visible. The obsidian crown, Kira breathed. The source of Shadowborn power, thought lost when our homeworld fell. Your parents hid it here. Centuries ago, apparently. Long before the final attack. She reached for the crown with trembling hands, then stopped. Adrian, if I put this on, I won't be the same person anymore. The crown doesn't just grant power, it awakens the full heritage of the Shadowborn bloodline. I'll become what I was born to be, but I might lose who I've learned to become. What do you mean? The Shadowborn weren't just rulers, they were warriors. Ancient, terrible, powerful beings who held dominion over life and death itself. The crown will restore my failing life force, give me access to abilities that your people would consider godlike. She looked at him with eyes full of pain. But it will also awaken instincts and impulses that have been dormant for 8 centuries. I might not remember why I care about protecting your people, or why your opinion matters to me. Adrian stared at the crown, understanding the impossible choice she faced. Is it the only way to stop the Void Dominion? Yes. They're using technology and tactics that predate human civilization. Your weapons, your strategies, even your most advanced technology, none of it will work against them. They'll systematically destroy every population center on this planet until I reveal myself, and then they'll drain the life force from every living thing just to make sure they've eliminated the last of the Shadowborn bloodline. And if you don't use the crown? Then I die as I've been dying for centuries, slowly, quietly, and uselessly. Your world falls, billions die, and the Void Dominion continues their ancient mission of consuming everything that was ever touched by Shadowborn influence. The chamber fell silent except for the distant hum of the palace above them. Adrian found himself studying Kira's face, the gentle features he'd come to care about, the kindness in her eyes that had drawn him to her despite every rational consideration. "There's a third option," he said finally. "Which is? We don't let you face this alone. You said the crown might change you, make you forget why you care about protecting people. But if someone you trust is there to remind you, to anchor you to who you choose to be rather than just who you were born to be." Kira stared at him. "You're suggesting you stay with me through the transformation. That's incredibly dangerous, Adrian. The energies released when the crown activates could kill you just from proximity. But it might also keep you grounded. Keep the part of you that I chose to be with." He reached for her hands, covering her cold fingers with his warm ones. "I didn't choose a Shadowborn princess, Kira. I chose a woman who sits alone in corners and apologizes for existing while secretly being the kindest person I've ever met. If the crown threatens that person, then maybe she needs someone to fight for her too. You could die. You could lose yourself. I think I prefer my odds." Kira looked between his face and the crown waiting in its ancient resting place. "The court that mocked your choice is about to discover that you selected the one person capable of saving them all. I selected you because you were worth choosing, not because of what you could do for anyone else." Adrian squeezed her hands gently. "That hasn't changed. Even if I become something terrible. Even then. Because the terrible thing would still be you, just more so. And maybe what the universe needs right now is someone terrible enough to face the Void Dominion on each." The transformation began the moment the obsidian crown touched Kira's silver hair. Adrian watched in fascination and terror as crystalline shadow flowed from the ancient artifact, spreading across her skin like living darkness. Her pale, translucent appearance began to change, taking on depth and luminescence that spoke of power held in check for centuries. "Kira," he called, though he wasn't sure she could hear him over the harmonic resonance filling the crypt. "Remember who you choose to be." Her eyes opened, and they blazed with starlight contained in cosmic darkness. When she spoke, her voice carried harmonics that made the ancient stones vibrate in sympathy. "I remember everything," she said, and Adrian felt relief that it was still recognizably her voice, despite its new depth. 800 years of hiding, of pretending to be weak, of accepting dismissal and mockery. Power crackled around her as she stood, no longer frail but moving with predatory grace. "I remember watching my world die while I cowered in these crypts like a frightened child. Kira. And I remember," she continued, her gaze finding his across the energy-charged air, "a prince who chose kindness over advantage, who saw worth where others saw weakness, who offered protection without expecting anything in return." The power radiating from her stabilized, becoming less chaotic and more controlled. The crown had settled into her hair as if it belonged there, and Adrian realized he was looking at what Kira had always been beneath her careful disguise, not a fragile colony girl, but a being of immense power who had learned to value gentleness over dominion. "How do you feel?" he asked. "Like myself, but more so." She flexed her fingers, and shadows danced between them like living creatures. "The crown hasn't changed who I am, Adrian. It's simply given me back the strength to be that person without apology." Above them, alarms began wailing again. The Void Dominion's ultimatum was nearly expired. "Are you ready for this?" Kira's smile was radiant and terrible. "I've been ready for 800 years." They emerged from the crypts to find the palace in chaos. The command center buzzed with desperate activity as staff tried to coordinate an evacuation that everyone knew was hopeless. When Adrian and Kira entered, conversation stopped mid-sentence. The woman who had hidden in corners now commanded the room simply by existing in it. The crown's crystalline shadows moved in her hair like living things, and her presence filled the space with an authority that spoke to something primal in everyone present. "General Morrison," she said, her voice carrying easily despite its measured tone, "please have your forces fall back to minimum safe distance. What happens next will be dramatic." "Lady Kira," Morrison began, then stopped, clearly struggling with how to address someone who looked like a goddess of war despite her familiar face. "What are your intentions?" "To remind the Void Dominion why they feared my people enough to hunt us across the galaxy." She moved to the tactical display, her transformed presence making the holographic projections flicker and dance. "They expect me to surrender, to accept defeat as my people did 8 centuries ago. They're about to learn that the last Shadowborn has had a very long time to plan her revenge." Chancellor Hayes stepped forward cautiously. "Your Highness, and I use that title advisedly now, what do you need from us?" "Clear the space around the palace. Evacuate the capital to a minimum radius of 50 kilometers. And..." She turned to Adrian with an expression that mixed royal command with personal affection. "I need someone to remind me why I'm fighting for preservation rather than annihilation. Kira. The crown carries the memories and impulses of every Shadowborn ruler who wore it before me. Some of them would solve this problem by turning this entire star system into a weapon against the Void Dominion. I need to remember why that's not acceptable." Adrian nodded, understanding. "Because innocent people live here. Because destruction for its own sake is what made the Void Dominion evil in the first place." "Exactly." She reached for his hand, and he was surprised to find her touch warm now instead of cold. "Stay close, Adrian. Help me be the person you chose rather than just the weapon I was born to be." The confrontation took place in the palace's main courtyard, under skies filled with alien ships that blotted out the stars. The Void Marshal materialized in a column of dark energy, his form simultaneously solid and incorporeal, a being of accumulated malice wearing the shape of Shadowborn nobility. "Little princess," he said in Shadow tongue, his voice carrying mockery that transcended language barriers. "Still hiding behind lesser species, I see. Have you come to surrender at last?" Kira replied in the same ancient language, her words making the very air shimmer with power. Adrian couldn't understand the conversation, but he could feel the weight of old hatred and ancient challenges being exchanged. "What are they saying?" General Morrison whispered from the command center, where everyone watched through remote feeds. "She's telling him," Adrian translated based on emotional context rather than linguistic knowledge, "that she's not the same person who ran from him 8 centuries ago." The Void Marshal's laugh was like the sound of dying stars. He gestured, and several of his ships began powering weapons that made space itself ripple with contained destruction. Kira raised one hand, shadows flowing from her fingers to form shapes that hurt to look at directly. When she spoke again, her voice carried across dimensions. "I am Kirathine Shadowborn, heir to the Obsidian Throne, daughter of the last free realm. You destroyed my world, scattered my people, and forced me to live 8 centuries in exile." Power built around her like a gathering storm. "But in that time, I learned something my ancestors never understood, that true strength comes not from dominion, but from protecting what you love." The battle that followed was unlike anything in recorded galactic history. Void Dominion ships that could phase through normal matter found themselves caught in nets of crystalline shadow. Weapons that could unmake entire planets were turned back on themselves by techniques that predated modern physics. But the most remarkable thing was how Kira fought, not with the devastating fury of ancient Shadowborn warfare, but with precise, controlled applications of power designed to disable rather than destroy. She was surgical where her ancestors had been apocalyptic, protecting even her enemies from unnecessary harm. "She's holding back," Adrian realized, watching the engagement from the command center. "She could end this in seconds, but she's choosing not to." "Why?" Morrison asked. "Because," Adrian said with growing understanding, "she's fighting to prove that power can be used for protection rather than conquest. She's showing them, and herself, what the Shadowborn could have been if they'd chosen differently." The Void Marshal, finding his forces systematically disabled rather than destroyed, attempted one final gambit. He opened rifts in space itself, trying to drain the life force from the planet below. Kira's response was immediate and absolute. She expanded her power to encompass the entire star system, sealing the rifts with barriers of crystallized light and shadow. The effort was enormous. Adrian could see it draining her even through her restored strength. "Kira," he called, knowing she would hear him across the battlefield. "You don't have to save everyone. Just save enough." Her reply came back through dimensions of thought and power. "I choose to save everyone, Adrian. That's what makes me different from them." When the battle ended, the Void Dominion fleet hung in space, their ships disabled but their crews alive. The Void Marshal himself knelt in the courtyard, his form flickering between substance and energy. "Impossible," he whispered in shadow tongue. "We destroyed your strength. We scattered your power. You destroyed my people," Kira replied, her voice carrying sadness alongside authority. "But you taught me something in the process. You showed me what happens when power exists only for its own sake." She gestured toward the palace behind her, toward the humans who had sheltered her unknowingly. "These people gave me something the old empire never had, purpose beyond dominion. What happens to us now? You leave.